Hi everyone, and welcome to the next session in this program. The next session is going to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on gender, schools, and education, and we'll have a range of presenters to tell a story that they've done research on these topics. I'm very, very pleased to present up first Dr. Deborah Shepherd, from the University of Stellenbosch in the economics department, and Professor Daniela Casal from WITS, who's also in the economics department. Deborah and Daniela, please go ahead.
Hi, Risa. I'm going to be presenting. I'm just going to share my screen quickly and let me know when you see it, please.
Sure.
Okay, you should be seeing my presentation.
Yes, we can see it, and it's maximized.
Fantastic, thank you. So thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to jump straight into it because I know we only have 10 minutes. So I'm sure many people on this call will now be well aware of the fact that there's a lot of global evidence that women have been disproportionately affected by the crisis, to the point that we now have this term coined she-cession. My co-authors and I, Deborah Shepherd and Dori Posel, have found that in South Africa, there have been particularly large effects when we look at our NIDS-CRAM data over the last year. So you heard about the NIDS-CRAM data in the previous session as well. So in this short presentation, I'm going to highlight for you some of the gendered findings with respect to labour market outcomes and the government's assistance to furloughed and unemployed workers. Obviously, there are other spheres in which women may have come off worse during this crisis. Gender-based violence is a really important one, but that is not something that our very short telephone survey could capture. So I won't comment on that any further, despite it being such an important issue in South Africa. So you've heard all about the NIDS-CRAM data. I just want to highlight one very important benefit of NIDS-CRAM, which is that in repeating a survey 5 times during the space of a year, it has allowed us to track the impact of different lockdown restrictions on employment outcomes. So this is a really important advantage relative to, for example, the QLFS, our labour force survey. And so we have information on 6 reference months, a pre-COVID baseline of February 2020, and then 5 months during which we can have a look at employment outcomes during varying levels of lockdown restrictions, ranging from the hard lockdown in April 2020, or L5, down to adjusted level 1 in March 2021, our final data point. And on this next slide, you're going to see immediately that lockdowns matter, right? Here on the top graph, you've got employment numbers for men and women. And in the bottom graph, you've got the percentage changes between the different lockdown levels, as well as in the final 2 bars, the overall change over the course of the year, February 2020 to March 2021. And the first thing I want you to have a look at is that really, really large shock to the labour market in that first month of the lockdown, so April 2020. You can see that women's employment fell by 23% and men's by 10%. So the relative impact was much larger for women. Or stating this in another way, women accounted for 2/3 of the jobs lost in that first month. The next thing to notice is that when lockdown levels became less restrictive, employment recovered substantially, both for men and women. There was another dip around the second wave of the COVID pandemic, around Christmas and New Year in South Africa, where we had to move back up to a stricter lockdown. But in general, we've seen a substantial recovery. Where do we stand as at the end of March 2021, so a year into the pandemic? Well, we still see a gendered impact, right? In those final 2 bars, you can see that women's employment was still down 8% compared to pre-COVID times, while men's employment was pretty much back to pre-COVID levels. So we see there's no significant difference from 0. Okay. Now what I'm going to show you is that a similar story emerges when you have a look at what happened at the intensive margin. So among the employed, what happened to the hours that they reported working per week. And again, you see that massive, massive drop between February and April 2020. Again, women were hit harder. Women's work hours went down by 35%, while men's went down by 26%. So that's a really big blow. What are we capturing here? Well, in that first month, we're also capturing the furloughed workers, right? So these are people who said that they had a job or a job to return to, but that either worked fewer hours or 0 hours, probably due to the lockdown restrictions in place. Again, you see the story of a really substantial recovery as lockdown levels became less restrictive. But yet again, you see that there's a gendered effect, where women's hours are still 2 hours less per week on average compared to pre-COVID times, while men's are pretty much back to pre-COVID levels, if not even a little bit higher. So why did we see this? Why do we see this in South Africa? Why do we see this globally? Well, there are a number of reasons why women have been affected disproportionately. The first important reason has to do with pre-COVID, women and men were already in different parts of the economy, right? So we already saw job segregation pre-COVID. Women and men tend to dominate in different occupations and different sectors. And in this particular crisis, the sectors that women were more dominant in have been hit harder. So think about, for instance, personal care, hospitality, tourism, domestic work, childcare services. These are all the kinds of jobs where social distancing is difficult and where lockdown restrictions have, imposed, I guess, restrictions on how these sectors can operate. Okay. The second key reason is that even within sectors and occupations, women tend to be in less secure kinds of jobs. So, for example, we know from our pre-COVID labor force survey data that women were already less likely to be registered on our unemployment insurance fund. So it may be that in times of economic downturn, women's jobs are just easier for employers to cut. Thirdly, there's some suggestion in our NIDS CRAM data that the new jobs that have been created have been taken up in greater number by males. And then lastly, we see a very important reason that childcare has shifted into the household, right? So with school closures and childcare closures, the burden of childcare shifted back into the household and women have been affected more. We see that in South Africa, particularly for two reasons. The first is that we have highly gendered living arrangements in South Africa, where women are much more likely to live with children than men are. So I'm not sure if you've heard of this rather startling statistic, that while the majority of children live with their mother or another female relative present in the household, only about 37% of South African children live with their father present in the household. So just by the nature of living arrangements, women do more care work. Secondly, even when women and men do live with children, we see women taking on more of the childcare work. So it's not surprising, therefore, when we asked our respondents directly, how did looking after children during the June 2020 lockdown affect your work prospects? So your ability to go to work the same number of hours as before, or search for work. More than twice as many women as men said yes to those questions. The last thing I wanted to share with you is the government's response for the government's assistance to the unemployed and the furloughed, because here we also see gendered impacts. Even though women were hit harder by the shock to the labor market, they've been able to benefit less from the two main schemes that the government introduced: the Unemployment Insurance Fund TERS scheme and the Social Relief of Distress Grant scheme. So the UIF TERS scheme, many of you will know, was your typical furloughed worker scheme, where workers who still had a job, but who couldn't work any hours or the full number of hours could claim a percentage of their salary through the UIF. Women were less able to claim from this fund because they were less likely to be registered on UIF and formally employed in the first place, right, as I mentioned earlier. The reason why women were unable to claim from the Social Relief of Distress grant, the new 350 Rand grant introduced initially for about 12 months, was because of the conditionality attached to this grant. It couldn't be paid out concurrently with any other government grant dispersed in South Africa. Now, as you'll know, I'm sure, well over 90% of the caregivers who collect a child support grant on behalf of a child are women in South Africa. And so inadvertently, the policy design was penalizing unemployed women who were also caring for their children. Importantly, very good news was announced when the president addressed the nation after the riots that occurred in July 2021, where he stated that not only would this grant be reintroduced until March next year, but the conditionality would also be dropped, so that from now on, caregivers will also be able to claim social protection in their own right. Okay, my last slide. Unfortunately, by this point, almost 18 months of the pandemic had passed, and the consequences of these gendered impacts are already being seen in our data, right? Hunger and food insecurity are widespread. You saw that earlier when Murray put up one of his slides, much higher than in the pre-COVID period. And what we've also seen in our data is that the gender gap in these measures, perhaps unsurprisingly, has risen, such that by our final wave, 39% of women reported that their household had run out of money to buy food, compared to 31% of men. And also a higher percentage of women living with children said that a child had gone hungry in their household, compared to a lower percentage of men. So as a final kind of take-home message, I think what our work has really highlighted over this last year is the importance of analyzing data through a gender lens and designing policy through a gendered lens, especially in a context where there is a lot of job segregation in the labor market and in the context of very gendered living arrangements and care arrangements in the country. Okay, I'm going to stop there now and hand over to the next person.
Thanks, Daniela. That was extremely useful, and I think a very powerful lens as to what's happening with respect to the differences between men and women. I'd now like to introduce and ask Mpumi to come to the stage. Mpumi, are you ready for your presentation?
Hi, Riza. This is Deborah. So I'll be starting the presentation and then we will see if Mpumi is able to join us. Apparently, there are some firewall issues at the moment. Okay, so I've just got confirmation. I'll be taking the full presentation.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. Please go ahead.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, are you able to see my slides?
Yes, we are. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on some work that myself and Mpumelelo Mohotlwane from the DBE were involved in over 4 waves of the NITS CRAM. I'll be presenting sort of a combination of all the results that we found, focusing on some really important issues within the basic education sector specifically. So just to provide context, there are about 13 million children who are enrolled in school. 95% of these children would be enrolled in the public sector. So that's according to 2019 data. We also know that the majority of public schools are no fee charging, otherwise referred to as quintile 1 to 3 schools. So something that has become very well known to us is that last year there was a lot of learning lost. Up to 196 days, or roughly 60% of the school year, has been lost since the start of the pandemic. We know that schools were closed fully in March until June 2020, and then there was a phased grade return from towards the middle of June. So from the picture on the right, you can see that in June, we had grade 7s and grade 12 learners returning to school. In July, we then had grade 6 and grade 11 and grade R learners joining them. And from August 2020, we saw that there was a full return of all grades. And then the year seemed to function on track until the 16th of December would have been the date when the academic year ended. In 2021, there have been fewer disruptions than in 2020. What we saw is there was a 2-week delay in the beginning of the year, and that was due to the second wave of the pandemic. And then we also saw there was an early closure of schools in July at the start of the third wave. So looking at this picture, we would see that schooling, all grades have been attending school this year. But this, however, doesn't give too much consideration to how timetable guidelines have affected learners. So we know as a result of guidelines of social distancing, for example, that learners are mostly attending school on either a rotational attendance basis, they're alternating classes on different days of the week, or even alternating between weeks, or there may be platooning where one group will attend in the morning and another group later in the day. What we know is that at the extreme, this has meant that some learners are only attending school once every 5 to 8 days. And that's because we're dealing with very large schools, which means that in order to meet the social distancing requirements, literally 15 to 20% of learners would be able to be at school on any given day. So what we tried to establish is how this closure within the schooling sector has impacted learners in multiple ways. The first way is attendance. So what we saw in July 2020 is that attendance largely followed patterns of phased school reopening. So we see that attendance was greatest amongst grade 6, 7, 11, and 12. By November 2020, which was NIDS Cram Wave 3, we saw that about 97% of adults reported that children had returned to school. So there was a substantial return of learners to school. But in April 2021, which was NIDS Cram Wave 5, we actually see that attendance was down from the end of 2020. So it was down from 97% to roughly 94.8%. And I've highlighted the grades where there was a significant decline in responses, and that's grade 2, grade 5, grade 7, and grade 11. So what we tried to do was then establish, well, is this drop in attendance going to have an impact on learner non-return or learner dropout within the basic education sector? So the question that was asked in all of the NIDS crams 2, 3, and 5 was, are there any learners in your household who have not yet returned to school? In November 2020, this was there were roughly 95% of adults who reported all learners in their household had returned to school. But by April 2021, this proportion had fallen significantly to 89.9%. So what we're seeing is that roughly 10% of households in South Africa are reporting the non-attendance of at least one school-going aged learner in their home. If we compare this to pre-COVID levels, this was 96%. And so what we try to do is make a sort of pre and post COVID evaluation of the number of learners who maybe haven't returned to school since the onset of the pandemic. And looking at 2018, this number of 96.4% of households saying that all learners are going to school is roughly equivalent to 98% attendance amongst 7 to 17-year-olds, and that's around 230 children not in school. If we make some assumptions about how learners are distributed across homes, we then see that attendance in 2021 has fallen to roughly 93 to 94%. And this means there is an additional 500,000 children not attending school. And this is higher than 20 years previously. With regards to learning losses, what we have so far are a number of estimates which are coming out of cohort panel studies. So the first one is comparing the early grade reading study done in 2020 to an earlier version of the same study, as well as story-powered schools. And we predict that 50 to 75% of a year of learning was lost in 2020. So that's 50 to 75% of a year over an average of 120 school days lost to foundation phase learners. A similar study done in the Eastern Cape through the Funda Wanda project showed that there was a similar learning loss of between 53 and 68%. So what we can conclude from this is that attendance is back 20 years. The estimate that is being provided in learning is that learning is back a decade. So a lot of loss within basic education. School meals is also something which has been of great concern to us. As you saw in the session prior to this one, there was mention of hunger and how hunger has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. And though there was some stabilization between June and October last year, we now find that hunger has remained at a higher level than pre-COVID, and it's around double pre-COVID levels. So what we do is we compare the number or proportion of learners who are receiving daily meals through the National School Nutrition Program, which is roughly 10 million learners, and that represents 82% of all public sector learners. When we look at July last year, we see that of the learners who were attending school, only 41% were reported to have been receiving a meal at school. And that's not on a daily basis, that's on a weekly basis. And we compare this to a pre-COVID level of 65% of weekly access to school meals amongst all learners attending basic schooling. By November, December, this proportion had increased to 49%. So that's a significant increase, but way below pre-COVID levels. And then in February, we actually found that the level of feeding had fallen slightly, but by April, May 2020, it was higher than what we saw when all grades were attending school in November, December 2020, and it is now at 57%. If we compare this to what has been reported in the National School Nutrition Program reports, this means that roughly 1.5 million learners are not receiving a daily meal.
Hey, Deborah, I am in now, thanks.
Okay, great.
Great. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I had some connectivity issues. I'm traveling in Limpopo. So moving on.
Mpumi, you've only got about 1 more minute. So,
yes.
So yeah, please.
Sure,
Thanks.
Sure, last 2 slides. So the next slide is about parent and caregiver worry about returning to school. The question is around how concerned parents are about their children returning to school, and I guess essentially trying to understand perceptions around that and whether we should expect children to return to school based on what their parents are saying. In July, we saw very high levels of worry about return to school at 74%, but that reduced drastically to about 52%. And in April 2021, it was at the lowest, 45%. Then to our finals, then amongst those who were worried, the biggest worry was linked with vulnerable households. So those who were food insecure, hungry, had children lacking access to meals, and those who had their children not returned to school in 2021. Then on to the last slide, the final puzzle of the teacher of schooling is teachers. Teachers are a big cohort that are in schools, and we were worried about their risk. Our teachers at an unacceptably high COVID-19 risk compared to others in the country. And this graph shows you pre-pandemic teacher mortality rates. So on average, about 5 teachers die per day. And then it shows you the rate of worry of death on the pandemic. And you can see 2 peaks, but these peaks were linked with the normal COVID-19 peaks in the country, and they were not specifically linked to schools returning. And so a big part of what we're trying to say here is in the latest wave, in this wave 5 of the NIS report, we saw 171 teacher access deaths. This is in 2021. But as you can see, we did not see a peak in the number of deaths in this period, which was where schools were open. The peaks that we saw were when we were having a first and second COVID wave in South Africa. And in fact, that 1123 number of teacher deaths happened when schools were closed. So the main takeaway from the slide is that teacher deaths are associated with peaks in COVID-19 in the country and the rest of communities, and they are not associated with schools being open. That's the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Mpumi. And I think that last point of yours is absolutely fundamental and something that NIDSCRAM was uniquely poised to be able to answer given what we were seeing in the data. So I'd now like to ask Josh and then Ihsan and Vimo, are you all going to present sequentially, or how are you going to approach this one, Josh?
We're going to present sequentially. I'll go first, then Ihsan, and then Vims.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Please go ahead.
Okay, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the impact of the different grants. Before getting going, I just wanted to say that this work all comes from joint work with people like Vimo, Ihsan, Rocco Zitsamia, and Marie Leibrandt. Especially many comes from one kind of piece of work we did together, but there are some other extra bits which especially were done with Ihsan Basir. So I don't want to implicate any of those people in these particular results that I'm showing, but it is a product of joint work. So I'm going to be speaking about the impact of the different grants in South Africa. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about what they look like prior to the pandemic. So as you all know, South Africa has a very substantial social grant system, and it transfers literally money monthly to literally millions of people, and it's our largest anti-poverty expenditure. It was significantly expanded in response to COVID-19, and that took two forms: grant top-ups, such as, for example, increases in the value of the CSG, and also an introduction of a new grant, the SRD. Ihsan's going to speak a bit about the CSG, and Tim is going to speak a bit about the SRD. So I'm going to focus here on the existing kind of pre-pandemic system. And so in particular, the data that I'm using is going to be pre-pandemic, the NIDS 2017 survey data. But before we get there, let's use some more up-to-date data. This is from SASSA, the administrative data, and this gives us an idea of, how many grants are distributed in South Africa and what do they cost. So the highlighted ones are the ones I want to focus on. And so you can see that the old age grants, around 3.7 million people receive it. Disability grants, around 1 million people receive it. For the child support grants, around 12.8 children are recipients, but caregivers receive that grant on behalf of children, and there are around about 7 million caregivers of children who received the CSG grant on their behalf. In terms of budget, you can see the old age grant and the child support grant are the biggest. And the old age grant has a bigger expenditure than the child support grant, even though fewer people receive it. That's because it has a much higher monthly value. So the old age grant, people get around 1,900 Rand per month, whereas for the CSG, you only get 460 Rand per month per child. What I'm not going to talk about here is the social relief of distress grant, except to say that there's roughly 6 million people received it in the last year. The value was 350 Rand per month. And so if we multiply those together, we get a costing of about 25 billion Rand. But that's extremely approximate. Not everybody received it every month. And maybe Tim will have more details on the SRD implementation. But I'm really going to focus on the old age CSG and CSG grant, with a little bit on the disability grant if people want at the end. So the key question about the impact of social grants is, how do they impact on household income? So in particular, where do they impact along the income distribution? So the way I'm going to talk about the income distribution throughout this presentation, and I want to make sure people understand it properly, is I'm going to be talking about deciles. So the bottom decile is basically the poorest 10% of people. That's decile 1. Decile 10 is the richest 10% of people. That's decile, the top decile, decile 10. What you can see from this little table on the left here is that in this data, this is inflation adjusted to 2021, but in this data, the poorest household, the poorest people in the poorest household had around 59 Rand per person per month, whereas you can even call them richest, but the richest people in the poorest decile had around 515 Rand per person per month. To take another example, people in the 5th decile, so people who are roughly in the middle of the income distribution, had around 1,358 Rand per person per month in income. And in the richest decile, they had around 1,770 Rand per month. Right. And so some things to take away from this is just, I want you to understand and make sure we all know what deciles I'm talking about, but also just to note that even in the middle of the income distribution, people are pretty poor in South Africa. People in the middle of the distribution will fall below many poverty lines. And you're talking about, under 2,000 Rand, for all of your expenditure per person per month. So what do grants look like grant income look like according to these categories? So what this graph is over here is if you look on this leftmost column, which is the income of people in the poorest decile, what we see, this green area says that 75% of those people's income is from social grants. Only 15% of their total income comes from the labor market. So what you can see is that the poorest people in South Africa, the bottom decile, rely extremely heavily on grant income in order to support themselves. And you can see this isn't just the poorest decile. For the bottom 3 or 4 deciles, up to the, a substantial amount of poor people's income comes directly from social grants. The social grant system is very well targeted. You can see that the richest decile gets basically no income from social grants. It's pretty much all labor market income, some investment income. And you can see how social grants are very well targeted, meaning they're progressive. The poor people, social grants are a bigger part of their income. And it's quite striking. This graph is a classic in the grants literature, and it really shows how important grants are for incomes of poor people in South Africa. And you don't even need to do any fancy econometric analysis. You can just immediately tell, looking at this picture, that grants are really, really crucial in terms of poverty. If you were to just remove all this green income, you would dramatically increase poverty in South Africa. Okay, so we know the social grant system as a whole is progressive. What about, of the 2 major grants, the child support grant and the old age grant, which one is more progressive? So let's look at the old age grant. So what this graph shows us over here is, the way you read it is, for example, let's again look at the poorest decile number 1. That dark blue 2 means that out of the 100, 2% of people in the poorest decile directly receive the old age grant. But 18% of people in the poorest decile are in a household which receives the old age grant. And we care about this because we think grant recipients, and we know grant recipients don't just use the income only on themselves, but they're shared with other people in their households. So we want to see not just, what percentage of the direct recipients, but we also want to see the kind of household recipients, people who get income indirectly. And so if we had to say how progressive is the old age grant looking at this picture, we might say, well, it looks fairly progressive because poorer people, say bottom 40, 50%, definitely receive more than the top 50%. Sorry, I should say there are more grant recipients in the bottom than in the top. But it looks a bit strange, right? Because there's this weird drop right at the bottom, but it doesn't look incredibly progressive. The problem with this figure is that this includes your old age grant income. So for example, somebody in the 6th decile here who receives the old age grant, maybe they're only in the 6th decile because of receiving the old age grant. So what we want to look at when we're looking at progressivity is where people would be in the income distribution if they didn't receive the old age grant. And here we can see that the old age grant is much more pro-poor. We can see that the people who receive the old age grant, if they didn't get it, 14% would be in the bottom decile. Sorry, not 40. 14% of people in the bottom decile would be old age grant recipients. Or we can see that over 50% of the people who in the bottom decile are old age grant recipients. So we can see that the old age grant, we can even see from this graph how it shifts people up the income distribution quite directly. What about the child support grant?
You need to wrap up soon.
Sorry, I've only had about 5 minutes, Reese. I'm going to take like 4 minutes or so. Still, all right. So in terms of the child support grant, we similarly see that it's very progressive, this is the same graph as we showed before, that the child support grant is very progressive. If we then take the version and says, where would you have been if you hadn't received the CSG, then we will still see, we see it's even more progressive, right? And so again, the CSG is also an extremely progressive grant. It doesn't shift people up the income distribution as much as the old age grant because it's a smaller value. But what's noticeable is huge numbers of people receive the child support grant. Depending which graph you look at, it's either like at the bottom, it's around 20% directly, and 80 or 90% of individuals at the bottom of the distribution receive the CSG indirectly because they live in a household of the CSG recipient. So very quickly, just this my second last slide. What are other effects that we know about other effects social grants have? So we know that they reduce poverty, as we've just seen. We know that they increase household investment, education and welfare, child welfare. They improve gender equality in the household. They have a whole lot of effects on household composition, which we can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. They decrease remittances to the elderly, so people don't have to send as much money to their parents or grandparents if those people receive grants. We have some evidence that the CSG doesn't increase fertility, and in fact, it decreases youth sexual activity. And there's a whole long debate about the labor supply effects of social grants. The other thing we might be interested in are multiplier effects. If you give social grants to people in a particular community, does it benefit the community at large? For example, if an old age grant recipient goes and buys some goods from the local shop because of the grant, that the shop owner maybe gets some more profits, maybe they employ more people, maybe they pay higher wages, and in that way the grants can have an effect above and beyond the direct effects on recipients. And maybe they do have that effect. There's a big study in Kenya which showed that when they implemented grants, which were about 8.5% of local GDP, consumption, income, revenue increased by 14 to 18%. So there was spillover effect above and beyond the effects on direct recipients. But on the other hand, there can be some negative impacts in that there's a study in the Philippines, which are that when they introduced they did a trial of grants, it actually increased food prices. And so people who didn't receive the grants couldn't afford food, and their children actually had increased stunting. We don't have a lot of evidence in South Africa on this yet, but we are, that's one of the projects that Iksan and I and some other people are looking into. Okay, last slide, Riza. As a kind of general overview of the South African social grant system, we want to say who is protected by social grants in SA. And as you can see, that in terms of the big categories, it's really the elderly and children and disabled people. And as we see in other countries, these are understood to be people dependent on the state for assistance. These are people who will struggle for various reasons to be able to support themselves via labor income on the labor market. The kind of implicit assumption, which is an argument that James Ferguson makes, is that able-bodied and prime-age people would be able to support themselves. They don't need state assistance. You see this in systems all around the world, for example, in Latin America. But the question is this true in South Africa? Can able-bodied prime-age people support themselves? We're a society which has very structural long-term unemployment. It's probably not the fault of individuals for the most part that they can't get jobs. As we all know here, there just aren't really enough jobs. So one of the things that people say we should be doing in South Africa is support directly for the unemployed, recognizing that they are not able to support themselves, not through any fault of their own, but because of the nature of the South African economy. One way this might happen is an extension of the social relief of distress grant, which Tim is going to talk about. But the SRD, as we know, has had a lot of implementation difficulties. It's a small value, it's only 350 Rand. And the question of how to expand it is a little bit unclear. In terms of making it available to everybody. 6 million people is not the scope of unemployment in South Africa, or not economically active people, which is much larger. And this is one of the reasons that there's this current debate on a basic income grant. The idea that we should guarantee that everybody has a minimum amount of income, whether that's from the labor market or through the grant system. And there's currently a big debate, obviously, about whether it should be targeted. You only give it to people who don't have other income, whether it should be universal, as in the big goes to everybody in South Africa. So I'm going to end there, and I look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thanks. So we're going to keep questions to the end. I think that Iksan and Vimo, I think you'll only have 5 minutes each. So if you can keep your presentations to 5 minutes, that would be great. Please go ahead and begin, Iksan.
That's great. Thank you so much, and thank you, Josh, for great presentation. So Josh has, can you see my screen? Can I confirm that you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, but not yet your slides. Now we can see your slides. Great.
So Josh has shared a really interesting poll that I'd encourage everyone to fill out, just asking, gauging support, whether people think a basic income guarantee grant of some kind, whether targeted or universal or no grant, is something that you personally would support, just as a poll for the room. But so while you're filling that out, I'm going to talk a little bit about the CSG, just a couple of 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and then Vimal's gonna end off. And just to give a little bit of more information, more detail from after what Josh has said about the CSG. The CSG is really the biggest social grants program in South Africa. And I mean, some of the key facts, so here's a table of key facts, and really some of the most outstanding things is that over half of the population in South Africa gets the child support grant in some form. So, as Josh mentioned earlier, there are about 13 million children that are on it, about 7 million caregivers. But if you include all other sorts of household members, anyone in the same household benefiting from that income indirectly, it's over half of the South African population. So it's really 1 in 2 people in South Africa are kind of very, very much affected by this by child support grant. The direct caregivers are also, the registered caregivers are also almost all women. And we'll see that becomes really important. I'm sure Tim will speak later to how the gender composition of the SRD and how that's changed under the inclusion of the caregiver criteria most recently. And then finally, it's interesting to note that, as Josh said, it's a progressive grant. It's probably the most progressive grant out of the options. And so you can see that the recipients are poorer than average here. So, for example, you can see even at the 75th percentile of CSG recipients, so that these are the richer CSG recipients, they are still earning, they are still living on less than kind of 1,800 rand per day, which, as Josh showed in those income deciles, that's still within the bottom 5 deciles of the country's population. And just an absolute amount, obviously, is extremely low. Yeah, personally, I've never lived on 1,800 rand per month per day per person for myself. And I mean, to take a little bit of a more historical look at the child support grant over time. This grant starts in just after, obviously, the fall of apartheid in the democratic era, 1998, 99, very low take-up initially. And it kind of increases over time, almost in line with the expansion of the age eligibility. So first, only under 8-year-olds could get it, then 10, 13, and eventually up until around 2010, 11, when it was expanded to what we currently have today, anyone under the age of 18, so up to 17, and that you pass a kind of means test as the caregiver. And we can see that really it's expanded, substantially up to about 13 million today in numbers. But in terms of the actual value of the grant, it started in around 2000 and around 300. This is all in real 2020 rands. Since around 2004, the value of the child support grant has really remained pretty flat at around 400 rand in terms of real 2020 value. And so the value of the actual CSG grant has been flat for a very long time, even though the actual number of people has expanded very substantially between 2000 and 2010 at least. And then, so this is very short. This is the final slide. So if you think about how well it reduces poverty, we can think about some past kind of simulations of what we think the impact of this for example, increasing the child support grant is compared to increasing the old age grant or the social relief of distress, or instituting the social relief of distress grant. And the child support grant really comes out clearly as the favorite. We ran this kind of simulation at least at the beginning of the pandemic to really show that if we want to have the maximum impact in terms of poverty reduction, you should put basically out of the options of an old age grant, a social relief distress grant, and a child support grant. You should put all of your money into the government should put all of the money into topping up the child support grant, just in terms of poverty impact, at least until a large amount, until you hit something like 1,000 rand top up of the current CSG. One of the really big strengths of the CSG is that there's a really great ease of implementation in really topping up this issue. So if you think about the pandemic initial top ups of around 500 rand to caregivers or 300 rand to the actual CSG, that really went directly into the hands of these caregivers, precisely because it was an already established system. We had everyone on the database, and so it could really go directly. Whereas if you think about the social relief of the stress grant, out of an estimated, say, 10 million people who we think from survey data should have been receiving the grant, 10 to 14 million people, only, as we see from the SASA records, only about 6 million actually receive it. And kind of probably the best explanation we have at this stage is because of implementation difficulties and access difficulties. And so this is a really important and key advantage of the CSG as a part of our system. All of those good things as said, we can still see that there are millions of poor children in South Africa today, despite the existence of the CSG. So if we look at the survey data, a quarter of children are still below the food poverty line, despite the existence of the CSG, and nearly half are above the upper bound poverty line. An important, supplement to this is the school feeding scheme, and as was said earlier, I think by Deborah Shepherd, this has been undertaken over the less than as much subscription over the pandemic. Okay, that's it from me from the CSG. Over to you, Vimo.
Thanks, Iksan. Please go ahead, Vimo. I can't hear your voice. Are you on mute, Vimo, or no? Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, Prof. We don't seem to hear you. Do you mind giving your page a quick refresh and then join us in a second again?
In the meanwhile, there's that basic income grant poll, which I know Vimo is keen to talk about. So if people haven't filled it in, you can go and fill in whether you support a big, targeted, universal, etc.
Am I back?
Yes, I think I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, everyone. So, yeah, I'm just going to say a few words on the stuff that Iksan and Josh have already discussed, and think of it from a kind of aggregate picture level. So, what we've already seen is there's a lot of evidence that they've shown, but there's a whole lot of literature before that as well, that the grants are large in terms of number of recipients and large in terms of aggregate expenditure. They're also very effective at reducing poverty levels, and they're well targeted, right? So there's lots of good things happening on this front. There are some ambiguities. For example, the labor market effects are uncertain or mixed. Let's say that's more precise. There's also some conjecture on the potential spillover and multiplier effects, which I don't think there's good enough evidence to make strong claims at this moment in time yet. So, but as Josh said, I think the big question that comes up now is about a basic income grant. And there immediately there's two questions. Is it a universal basic income grant? That means everyone gets it, or a targeted one? That's an important question. We have undoubtedly one of the most unequal societies in the world. And if you're saying you want to have a universal basic income grant, that means even the high income earners, who are a small fraction of people, but a large number of people nonetheless, should be getting this grant. And so that's an interesting question, because all the evidence that Josh and Ishan showed us was that the targeting is a key part of why these other grants, existing grants, are so successful. So that's just important to keep in mind. My own view, and it depends on your own values ultimately, of whether you support a basic income grant or not, would be depending on your philosophical view of what's the obligation of a state. But whether you think we should look after the weakest or most vulnerable people in a society, or whether you think we need to maximize aggregate welfare, the two would lead you to the same conclusion, because there's so many people who are in financial need here. And so it's quite hard from a social justice or moral philosophy perspective to argue against one. The valid issues that come up are, how would you fund this? And then there's a question of funding now, which is a moment of disaster, but how would you fund it in perpetuity, right? And we do have fiscal constraints, which are real. You can't, it would be very expensive to fund it off debt. You could raise taxes, or you could cut expenditure from other places. And then those are political questions in the end, because there's always going to be trade-offs, and you can't avoid the trade-offs. So I think it's a difficult question. I think personally that what we've seen is that there's a growing number of people who are really struggling. And, we need to recall that even before, in January, Q1 of last year, before the pandemic came, our unemployment rate was about 30%. So Josh's point that we have this incredibly high level of structural unemployment is completely valid. And that's not going to change in any near future. And so it is a value statement when we say we don't want young, able-bodied people to get a grant because they should be able to work, when it's just not empirically true. That's not grounded in any empirical fact. And so I don't have an answer. I mean, I have a personal view, but in the end, people need to figure out their own positions. I still think that there is this hard nuance of how do you finance it then at that point. And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Vimo. Now like to invite Tim Kohler to present to us. Tim, are you ready?
Yes, Harry's, I'm ready. Let me just share my screen. Right, just confirming you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. Thanks.
Great, I'll get right into it. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm a junior researcher and PhD candidate in the Development Policy Research Unit in the School of Economics at UCT. And today I'll just be speaking quite briefly, given the time constraints, on both the coverage of South Africa's special COVID-19 grant in terms of who actually benefited and how did that benefit vary across different population groups, as well as what we currently know about its impact so far. So just as a bit of a background, we know that lockdown policies around the world, especially in South Africa, were always expected to have substantial costs. Looking at the poverty side of things, the latest estimates suggest that between 120 and 124 million people, more people are estimated to be pushed into extreme poverty, which in other words eradicates progress since 2017. And we know that this distribution of poverty effects, so to speak, is incredibly unequal. For instance, a third of the new poor are estimated to be based in sub-Saharan Africa. And for the region, extreme poverty levels are expected to rise by nearly 3 percentage points, which essentially eradicates poverty progress, or progress against poverty back to 2011 levels. So a huge problem on our hands. And one of the key responses by governments across the world, including South Africa, to respond to the pandemic and help provide some income or in other forms relief to vulnerable households was to expand their social protection systems. For instance, by May this year, over 200 countries had over 3,300 social protection measures in response to the pandemic in place. And half of these measures took the form of social assistance, with cash transfers or social grants representing half of those programs. Now, the previous presenters went over how this was the case in South Africa too, whereas we expanded the system on both the intensive and extensive margins. On the intensive margin, every pre-existing grant was topped up. On the extensive margin, we introduced the new special 350 Rand COVID-19 SID grant. So as Josh and Izan discussed before, prior to the pandemic, South Africa's social grant system can be said, at least how James Ferguson argues, it can be assumed that the system presumed prime-aged, able-bodied people need not receive state support because they could support themselves through the labor market. Of course, as previously discussed, this view arguably neglects the widespread structural nature of unemployment in the country, where we know about 71-72% of the unemployed have been unemployed for more than a year. In a sense, the introduction of the COVID grant partially addressed this hole. We know that all other grants primarily target and pretty well target the disabled, elderly, and children in low-income households. But the COVID grant, on the other hand, was the first, at least in the post-apartheid period, to target unemployed adults who received no other forms of state support. That was, of course, initially only available for 6 months, but was extended for a few more months, and then was recently extended and expanded this year to last until March next year. So in this presentation here, I'll have a brief look at who benefited from the grant, and we'll also consider some very preliminary evidence on some labor market effects, considering that given the distinct nature of the targeting group of this grant, it's plausible to suspect that effects might vary relative to other grants. So looking at the system prior to the pandemic, I won't look at this in detail because the prior presenters did. What I want to focus on is that we know that about 18 million grants are distributed per month. And this grew by about 4 million grants in the last 10 years, from about 14 million to 80 million. What I'd also like to emphasize is that the majority of the recipients are women. About 85% of grant recipients are women, and specifically the CSG, about 97, 98% of caregivers who receive the CSG on behalf of children are women, which is important when we consider the eligibility criteria of the SRD grant. So despite this relatively comprehensive system and this wide coverage, we know that there's still, prior to the pandemic, a gaping hole. That is that no one in the working age population who are able-bodied have any form of assistance. Now we know that the expansion of the system, at least on the extension margin, was driven by the introduction of the COVID grant. Again, here prior to the pandemic, we had about 18 million grants distributed per month. And in the space of a few months, this increased significantly by about 6 million people to over 24 million grants distributed per month. And now importantly, when we look at disaggregate the number of grants distributed per month by grant type, we see that that was driven by the introduction of the COVID grant. Of course, the data used here is from administrative SASA data and is on the number of grants distributed for a particular month, but not necessarily in a particular month. We don't have data on that, at least from SASA. So that's important to consider because we know in the beginning of the COVID grants implementation that there were some significant delays owing to verification systems, etc. But the main point here is that it seems that the introduction of the COVID grant on the extensive margin significantly brought in millions of previously unreached adults into the system, making it in terms of the number of grants distributed, the second largest grant in the country next to the CSG, of course. Now, looking at who benefited, we just consider some characteristics as per the NISCRAM data. This is for October last year, but when we look at it over time, there's not much variation. So what I'd like to focus on is about 63%, most recipients are men. About 60% of recipients are young, within the age of 18 to 34 years. And most recipients have up to a metric qualification. Considering the grant explicitly uses a labor market criterion to target recipients, specifically unemployed adults with no other form of support, we consider how receipt varies across different labor market statuses. According to the NISCRAM data, what we see is that about 60% of it includes the unemployed by the broad definition as well as the inactive. So about 40% are employed. But importantly, although this might seem like some sort of inclusion error, the vast majority of employed recipients here of the COVID grant are employed in the informal sector. So it seems like the data suggests that the grant has provided an important source of income relief, not only to unemployed adults who are unable to participate and get support or relief from the labor market, but as well as individuals operating in the informal sector. When we consider different labor market transitions, we see that the group that was more likely to receive the grant were those who were in a state of chronic unemployment. I'm going to skip over adequacy just because of time purposes. When we consider the progressivity of the grant, we see that most applicants and recipients are based in the lower parts of the distribution. So this just shows a bar graph of the proportion of individuals who, conditional on applying, successfully received the grant, didn't receive the grant, their application is still pending, or they didn't apply at all. And we see that, for instance, about 23% of adults in the poorest 10% of households applied and were successful in getting the grant, as opposed to less than 1% of adults in the richest 10% of households. The majority of adults in the richest 10% of households didn't even apply for the grant, which is expected. And when we consider the concentration curves of the grant, specifically this plots the cumulative proportion of expenditure on the grant against the cumulative proportion of individuals in households ordered by their per capita household incomes. we continue to see a relatively pro-poor distribution. For instance, about 80% of spending on the COVID grant accrues to about the poorest 60% of the population. We do document some notable poverty and inequality effects with just using a technique called fiscal incidence analysis, which gives us some sense of what poverty and inequality might have been like in the absence of the grant. And what we basically find here is we estimate that the Gini coefficient, for instance, would have reduced by, would have been about 1.3% higher in the absence of the grant. And using other inequality measures here, we see a similar story. And importantly, when looking at poverty, we see that the data suggests that in the absence of the grant, poverty would have been about 5% higher. In other words, that translates to about 2 percentage points, which I know in some of Josh and his other research.
Tim, you have about 1 minute left.
Did you
Yes.
say 1 minute? Sorry. Okay, cool. Thanks. I'll wrap up. So just briefly on some labor market effects, this is some very preliminary evidence, so we're still doing this work. But basically, what I'd like to emphasize here is that although the grant's main goal isn't to aid labor market recovery, but to provide income relief to vulnerable adults, an analysis of labor market effects might be important to policymakers given the common concern that grant programs may discourage work. And what we find here is by using a technique which allows us to compare comparable COVID-19 grant recipients and non-recipients over time, we get suggestive evidence that the receipt of the grant increases the probability of participating in the labor market through job search by about 25 percentage points, and that it is a significant estimate. But again, that is preliminary evidence that I'm happy to talk about later. So in conclusion, we know that before the pandemic, the social assistance system provided little to no support to prime-aged, able-bodied individuals due to the belief that they could get the support through the labor market. This view arguably neglects the widespread structural nature of unemployment in South Africa, and arguably this hole at least partially was addressed through the introduction of the COVID grant, bringing in more than 6 million previously unreached adults into the system, which, if you remember the growth of the system, it grew by about 4 million grants distributed in the 10 years preceding the pandemic. So this grant exceeded the growth of the whole system in the last decade. Survey data suggests that the grant primarily benefited unemployed young men. It was relatively well targeted to the unemployed. Application for and receipt of the grant was pro-poor. There's some notable poverty and inequality effects, and preliminary evidence suggests it aided the recovery of the labor market to some extent. Where to now? Well, arguably, it depends on your value judgments and the empirical evidence, of course, but depending on the trajectory of the economic recovery and the fiscus, social assistance policy going forward ought to consider the changing dynamics of the labor market. In other words, job creation and social assistance policy aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. The evidence here suggests that the grant has been effective in providing progressive income relief and may have contributed to the recovery of the labor market that we've seen so far. However, there has been a concern that most recipients are men. Now, Deborah and Daniela spoke earlier about the expansion of eligibility criteria. We know that this is mostly because current social grant recipients weren't permitted to receive the grant, and most social grant recipients are women. Recent changes allowed for unemployed CSG caregivers to apply, and rough estimates suggest that this might increase the number of women receiving the COVID grant by 3 to 4 million, which would increase their share from 35% of COVID recipients to 60%. Final question that I'd like to leave with you is, should the COVID grant be further extended in some form, in either the short term or the long term? And would this take the form of a UBI or a BIG? And would that be truly universal, or should it be targeted? Who would be eligible? How can it be sustainably financed? And what should the amount be? It's important to consider the details here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. That was a very insightful presentation. We were, in fact, given an extra 10 minutes, but by virtue of the fact that we were all slightly over time, we've now exhausted those 10 minutes. I would like to encourage the audience to please continue voting on the polls. There have been some very interesting polls posed by different presenters today. I see there's been an active Q&A as well, and that there have been questions and answers in that Q&A. Because we're out of time, I do have to ask you now to please email the presenters any further questions you may have. because there isn't further scope to take more questions now. With that said, I'd now like to conclude this session and hand over back to Godfrey Mashamba, who's the DDG of the DPME. Thank you all for engaging in this fascinating session. It's been a privilege to be your facilitator.